The Untold Truth of America's WWI German POW camps. While the United States originally stayed out of World War I, the beginning of 1917 saw Germany push the country's lawmakers to the limit. The German Navy had resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking several ships that carried American passengers and goods. Each attack sent waves of outrage through American society, newspapers filled with reports of civilian deaths, and President Woodrow Wilson's calls for patience grew harder to sustain. By April 1917, the mood in Washington had changed. The pressure from Congress, from the public, and from global circumstances all led to one conclusion. During the first week of April, President Wilson asked Congress to declare war on Germany. It was a monumental shift for a nation that had prided itself on neutrality, but it also marked the beginning of a chapter many Americans would rather forget. Months later, on November 16, 1917, President Wilson signed and released Proclamation No. 1408. This was not a military order but a sweeping domestic policy. It restricted the movements of German nationals within the United States and required every one of them to register with the government. It further declared that any natives, citizens, denizens, or subjects of the hostile nation or government, being males of the age of 14 years and upwards, who shall be within the United States, and not actually naturalized, shall be liable to be apprehended, restrained, secured, and removed as alien enemies. In essence, simply being German and male was now enough to make a person a potential prisoner. Thousands would learn this truth the hard way. Over the following months, men were detained in cities across the country, some with no clear accusation beyond their nationality. While not all of them were given official prisoner of war status, the line between civilian detainee and POW blurred quickly. Many were placed in the same camps, behind the same fences, and under the same watchful eyes of armed guards. Some of them would never leave those camps alive. Before the United States formally entered the war, a few German citizens already found themselves in uneasy circumstances. From the very start of the conflict in 1914, America's neutrality had been more theoretical than practical. While the government had not declared allegiance, the economic ties with Britain and France were too deep to ignore. American industries supplied the Allied powers with weapons, ammunition, food, and equipment. Germany saw this as a betrayal of neutrality. To many German immigrants and sailors stranded in American waters, it meant they were in a country that no longer felt friendly. One of the first notable groups to experience this shift was the crew of the SS Cormoran. The German ship, low on coal and supplies, was forced to dock in Guam, an American territory in the Pacific. At first, the sailors were treated with cautious politeness. The island did not have the provisions to allow them to refuel and continue their journey, so they remained aboard their vessel under the watch of American authorities. For several years, the Cormoran sat in Guam's harbor like a ship frozen in time. The crew became part of island life, interacting peacefully with the local population. But when 1917 arrived and America entered the war, everything changed. The German sailors were reclassified as enemy combatants. The Cormoran was scuttled by its own crew to prevent capture, and 7 men lost their lives in the explosion. The survivors became the first German prisoners of war held by the United States in the Great War. Similar fates met other German crews across the world. Ships docked in ports from New York to Puerto Rico and Panama found their freedom gone overnight. Their sailors were detained and their vessels seized. At first, they were held in local facilities, navy yards, immigration stations, or temporary holding areas, while the government deliberated over what to do with them. Eventually, Washington decided to create dedicated prisoner of war camps on American soil. It was an unprecedented move. The United States had not dealt with enemy prisoners in such numbers since the Civil War, and the military had to learn from scratch how to house, feed, and guard foreign captives. 3 main locations were chosen for the internment of German POWs: Fort Oglethorpe and Fort McPherson in Georgia, and Fort Douglas in Utah. All were existing military sites, but none were equipped to handle thousands of prisoners. The first task for the Army was to build new facilities: barracks, fences, guard towers, and kitchens. Ironically, the labor for this construction came from the prisoners themselves. Under military supervision, the Germans built the very structures that would confine them. Once completed, they were also responsible for maintaining their own camps, cleaning, repairing, and running daily operations. Despite growing anti-German sentiment across the nation, local reactions to the camps varied. In Georgia, opinions were divided. Some residents welcomed the camps for the jobs and business they brought, while others distrusted the foreign men suddenly living so close. In Utah, the reception was unexpectedly warm. Fort Douglas, perched near Salt Lake City, became a source of local pride and economic activity. Utahns saw the camp as an opportunity, a way to contribute to the war effort, and to bring money into the state. When word spread that prisoners would be transferred from Utah to Georgia in 1918, locals protested bitterly. They did not want to lose what they saw as their share of the wartime enterprise. While the military camps housed most of the prisoners, a separate problem soon arose. Not every German in American custody was a soldier or sailor. Some were scholars, musicians, businessmen, and students, civilians who had been caught up in suspicion. These enemy aliens, as they were officially labeled, were placed under the authority of the Department of Labor, rather than the War Department. To hold them, the government rented a former resort in Hot Springs, North Carolina. It was a picturesque mountain town, known for its natural springs and scenic beauty, now transformed into a place of confinement. The irony was striking. A location once dedicated to rest and healing became a prison. At Hot Springs, the detainees found themselves living in a curious blend of restriction and comfort. The main hotel served as housing, and its amenities, including a swimming pool, remained available. The men were allowed to walk the grounds under supervision and to work on construction projects. They built barracks, latrines, and fences, but also created something far more unique, a miniature German village. The prisoners, many of whom were craftsmen and artists, constructed cabins, chapels, and decorative structures reminiscent of their homeland. They even built a functioning fairground ride, a swinging chair carousel that became a beloved diversion. The camp at Hot Springs became both a symbol of captivity and of resilience, a small reminder of home in a foreign land. Elsewhere, the reasons for detainment were often bewildering. While most Germans living in America were required to register as alien enemies, few were actually imprisoned. Those who were tended to have drawn attention for peculiar or arbitrary reasons. In Boston, Karl Muck, the distinguished conductor of the Boston Symphony Orchestra, was arrested. His supposed crime was refusing to play the Star-Spangled Banner before a concert, an accusation that later turned out to be false. He was, in truth, a Swiss citizen of German birth, yet that nuance did not spare him. He was sent to Fort Oglethorpe and held for months. The poet Erich Posselt suffered a similar fate. A search of his home revealed a poem that made a light-hearted jest about America. Though it had never been published, it was enough to earn him detention. Another man, Ernst Fritz Kuhn, a banker, was deemed simply too wealthy to be trusted and was also interned. These cases illustrated how suspicion and fear had blurred the line between justice and paranoia. Despite these injustices, the U.S. government was eager to portray its treatment of prisoners as humane. America wanted to ensure that its own captured soldiers in Europe would be treated fairly, so it publicized the conditions in its camps as models of decency. In many respects, this was not mere propaganda. Reports from the time suggest that the camps were run with a degree of order and respect uncommon in wartime detention. Prisoners were awakened each morning at 5:45 a.m. They worked 8-hour days, usually maintaining the camp, cooking, cleaning, or performing skilled labor. Those who worked outside the camp, such as on nearby farms or in local factories, were paid the same wages as American civilians. Their earnings were kept in individual accounts for later withdrawal. When Germany refused to pay American POWs fairly, the U.S. reduced the Germans' pay in response, a tit-for-tat adjustment that reflected the strange diplomacy of captivity. Rations were equivalent to those of American soldiers. Meals were simple but filling, and the German cooks at Fort Oglethorpe ensured the food had a touch of home. Letters were permitted, though censored, and mail was both a comfort and a source of frustration. Censorship often cut off parts of messages, leaving families confused or worried. Many prisoners complained, writing letters to Congress and newspapers, asking to be recognized under formal legal categories. Their status as alien enemies left them in limbo, not quite prisoners of war, not ordinary criminals, and not free men either. Among the camps, Fort Oglethorpe developed a unique reputation. Within its walls was a section known as Camp A, the so-called Millionaires' Camp. It housed about 90 men, many of them wealthy or prominent individuals, who could afford to pay a monthly fee for improved conditions. For $25 to $35 per month, they received private rooms, better food, and personal space. They tended small gardens, played music, and dined together while a fellow prisoner played the piano. They were allowed to hire other detainees as servants and to supplement their rations with purchased food. Though still confined, life there was far more comfortable than in the crowded dormitories of Camp B. Karl Muck was among the notable residents of Camp A. After his release, he reportedly spoke of the humane treatment he received, though his private letters revealed a deeper pain. Detention had broken his health and career. The experience left him bitter, and though he later resumed conducting in Europe, he never returned to the United States. Inside the camps, boredom and monotony became constant enemies. Men who had lived active, creative lives now found themselves fenced in by barbed wire and routine. Some developed what became known as barbed wire disease, a form of depression and anxiety brought on by confinement. To combat it, the camps encouraged recreation. Gardening was popular, with prisoners cultivating flowers and vegetables around their barracks. Sports became a major outlet. Volleyball, soccer, tennis, and handball were played daily, with tournaments organized between teams. Competitions were taken seriously, with prizes awarded to the winners. It gave the men something to train for, something to anticipate. Cultural and intellectual activities also flourished. At Fort Oglethorpe, so many professional musicians were imprisoned that they formed full orchestras and held regular concerts. There were newspapers produced by prisoners, written in German and printed with makeshift equipment. A camp university emerged, where professors and scholars lectured on subjects ranging from mathematics to literature. Evenings were often filled with plays and performances. A small theater was built from scrap wood, where the men acted out modern dramas and classical works. Once a week, a film was shown, silent, flickering images that reminded them of a world beyond the wire. As the months went on, the rhythm of camp life became both predictable and suffocating. The prisoners learned to measure time not in weeks or months, but in the number of guard shifts, mail deliveries, and meal bells that broke the silence. The sense of isolation grew deeper with each passing season. They could hear the world changing outside the fences, but for them, time had nearly stopped. Still, life in the camps was not without its tensions. Fights broke out between prisoners, sometimes over national pride, sometimes over politics. Within the German ranks, divisions appeared between officers and common sailors, between civilians and soldiers, and even between men of different German states. The guards, many of whom had never encountered foreigners before, watched with curiosity and suspicion. For some of the American soldiers assigned to guard duty, the prisoners were not enemies but curiosities, men who spoke strange languages, played fine music, and behaved with a quiet dignity. For others, the Germans were a constant reminder of a war they did not fully understand. Despite the discipline, a few attempted escape. At Fort McPherson, a small group of sailors once slipped under the wire during a night storm. They made it as far as a nearby forest before hunger and cold forced them to return. In Utah, 2 men managed to reach Salt Lake City by hiding in a supply wagon. They were captured at the railway station within hours, trying to buy tickets under assumed names. Each attempt ended the same way: recapture, punishment, and heavier surveillance. But these attempts spoke volumes about the human longing for freedom that no fence could erase. By 1918, the war in Europe had reached its final, brutal phase. News of the fighting filtered into the camps through newspapers and guards' gossip. The men followed the reports anxiously, reading about the collapse of the German front and the growing hunger at home. Some feared for their families, others refused to believe the empire could fall. When the armistice was finally announced on November 11, 1918, the reaction in the camps was complex. The guards celebrated openly. The prisoners, however, stood in stunned silence. Peace meant victory for one side and humiliation for the other. For them, it also meant uncertainty. They did not know whether freedom would come soon, or whether they would be forgotten in a foreign land. In theory, the signing of the armistice should have brought their release. In practice, many Germans remained in custody for months, even years, after the war ended. Transportation was limited, and political concerns delayed repatriation. The Spanish flu pandemic that swept through the world in 1918 also reached the camps, further complicating any immediate return. Dozens of prisoners fell ill, and some died far from home, their graves marked only by small wooden crosses. At Fort Douglas in Utah, tragedy struck in a particularly haunting way. On one cold December night in 1918, guards opened fire on a group of prisoners during a disturbance. Accounts differ on what started it. Some say a misunderstanding during roll call, others a failed escape attempt. In the chaos, several men were shot. 6 died instantly, and more were wounded. Their bodies were buried in a quiet section of the camp cemetery, where the wind from the mountains still moves through the dry grass. Years later, that burial ground would become a small German memorial, tended by local residents and the German consulate. The treatment of women during this period is a lesser, known but equally revealing part of the story. While men filled the official internment camps, German and Austrian women living in America also came under suspicion. Most were not imprisoned, but they lived under strict restrictions. They had to register as enemy aliens, carry identification cards, and report any change of residence to the authorities. Mail and telephones were monitored. Even attending church could draw unwanted attention if services were held in German. A few women who spoke out too boldly or associated with known male detainees were themselves arrested. In Fort Oglethorpe, a small section was eventually built for female internees. It housed about 50 women, many of them wives of detained men. They lived separately, in quieter surroundings, but their confinement was real. Their daily life was filled with sewing, letter writing, and silent waiting. The psychological burden of detention often lingered long after the war ended. For many of the men, release did not mean return to normal life. When they finally boarded ships back to Germany in 1919, they were greeted not by the empire they had left, but by a nation in turmoil. The monarchy had fallen, revolution had erupted, and hunger haunted every city. Some had no homes to return to. Others, disillusioned, chose to remain in America, though their citizenship applications were now tainted by the label enemy alien. A few were quietly allowed to stay under supervision, blending into immigrant communities that would, decades later, face suspicion once again during World War II. For the United States, the internment program faded quickly from memory. It was overshadowed by the roaring 1920, by economic boom, and later by depression, by another, greater war that would follow. Yet, in hindsight, the German POW camps of World War I marked the beginning of a pattern. It was the first time the federal government had built a nationwide system of detention for foreign nationals. The administrative framework, the registration cards, the surveillance methods, all of it would return during the Second World War, this time on a much larger scale, targeting not only Germans but also Italians and Japanese Americans. At Fort Oglethorpe, after the last prisoners were released, the camp buildings stood empty for months. Grass grew between the barracks, and silence replaced the once familiar sounds of drills and laughter. Eventually, the army reclaimed the land. Some of the structures were dismantled, others were repurposed for training new soldiers. Local residents remembered the German prisoners with a curious mixture of nostalgia and unease. Many had attended the concerts performed by the camp orchestra or bought handcrafted souvenirs made by the detainees. They spoke of the men's politeness, their discipline, and their longing for home. In Hot Springs, the story ended differently. When the civilian camp closed, the property was returned to its owners. The small German village built by the prisoners was gradually reclaimed by the forest. Only a few foundations remained, hidden among trees and wildflowers. Yet, for years afterward, townspeople would tell stories of the time when foreign men had turned their resort into a little piece of Europe. It was, as one elderly resident later said, a strange peace in the middle of war. The memory of these camps has been largely absent from American education and public discourse. Unlike the well-documented internment of Japanese Americans in World War II, the German detentions of 1917-1919 were seldom revisited. Archives preserve official records, but the human voices, the letters, the songs, the quiet reflections, remain scattered and forgotten. Historians who have studied them often express surprise at the balance between humanity and injustice that characterized them. The camps were not brutal death factories, but they represented a moral dilemma. How a democratic nation, in fear and anger, could turn against its own principles of fairness. Some prisoners left behind detailed memoirs. They described moments of deep despair, but also small acts of kindness. An American guard sharing a cigarette through the fence. A farmer's family bringing extra bread to the men working in their fields. A group of prisoners singing Christmas carols, joined by local townspeople who stood outside the barbed wire to listen. Such moments did not erase the injustice, but they revealed a shared humanity that war could not completely destroy. At Fort Douglas, one grave in particular came to symbolize that complexity. It belonged to a sailor named Friedrich Kunz, who died during the influenza outbreak of 1918. Decades later, when the cemetery was renovated, local schoolchildren helped clean and restore the old German headstones. They learned that the men buried there had once been called enemies, yet in death, they had become part of American soil. That small gesture of remembrance bridged the gap between past and present more powerfully than any speech. Today, the physical traces of America's World War I prison camps are few. At Fort Oglethorpe, only fragments of foundations remain, hidden behind modern buildings. In Hot Springs, a historical marker stands near the site, telling visitors that this quiet town once housed over 2,000 men. In Utah, the Fort Douglas Cemetery still bears the stone crosses of German sailors, standing neatly among the graves of American soldiers. Visitors sometimes leave small flags or flowers there, not out of allegiance, but out of respect for lives caught in history's current. Modern historians have begun to re-examine this chapter with fresh eyes. They see it not only as a wartime necessity, but as a reflection of how nations balance fear and freedom. The story of these camps challenges the idea that democracy is immune to overreach. It reminds us that even a nation built on liberty can, in times of fear, build fences against its own ideals. Yet it also tells of resilience, of men who built gardens in captivity, who played music amid barbed wire, who wrote poems of longing rather than hatred. Their quiet endurance offers a lesson that reaches beyond borders and centuries. It shows that dignity can survive even under guard towers, and that compassion can find a voice even between enemies. The legacy of America's World War I POW camps is not one of cruelty but of contradiction. They were places where justice met prejudice, where kindness coexisted with control. They reveal a nation learning in painful steps what it means to wield power responsibly. In those camps, on American soil, men who had once served the Kaiser lived and worked under the stars and stripes. They left behind gardens, songs, and graves, small, silent reminders of a war that reached across oceans and into the heart of America itself. History has a way of burying its quieter stories beneath louder ones, but if we listen carefully, we can still hear the echoes. The clang of tools on wood as prisoners built their own barracks. The soft strains of a violin in a barrack after sunset. The murmur of German voices blending with the distant sound of trains beyond the fence. It is a sound neither of victory nor defeat, but of endurance. It belongs to those who lived through an unwanted captivity, who found small fragments of humanity in an inhuman time. And so, the story of the German prisoners of World War I in America remains not only a tale of confinement, but a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit. It reminds us that history is not made only on the battlefields of Europe, but also in the quiet corners of distant lands, where even enemies learned, however briefly, to live with grace.